No, I don't think it has. I've always been a fairly conservative religious person, believing in a fairly traditional sort of God. What has changed is my reasons for believing this, which have, I hope, become deeper as a result of philosophizing. And of course I've changed my views on lesser matters within the scope of traditional religion, but not about itself. I often feel a bit guilty about this because I greatly admire people who have a certain worldview and then come to have it certain important life experiences or been exposed to certain arguments and suddenly abandoned it and given up that view and adopted a different one. And I think these are highly rational people, so surely if I'm a rational people I ought to have given up my worldview. On the other hand, if I'm a rational person I must be guided by the reasons which seem to me correct ones, and so I've stuck where I am, roughly speaking. Well, they don't discover a new planet or a new fundamental particle or anything like that. They do, I think, discover new principles of reasoning and new principles of how the world works. To start with the first, I think philosophers have helped us to understand how you produce reasons for a conclusion and what are good reasons for a conclusion. They've formalized systems of deductive logic, which is a matter of drawing out a conclusion implicit in the premises, and they've also, in the last 200 or 300 years, formalized the process of probabilistic reasoning, whereby certain premises record pieces of scientific evidence, as it were, and the scientist reaches a conclusion, and the philosopher has helped to codify these processes. And in the doing so, of course, it can show that various arguments of the past aren't any good because they don't conform to these principles, and various arguments of the present as well. I think a philosopher has discovered also certain very general truths, though the moment one says that, one has to say that, well, I think philosophy has discovered these things, but of course some other philosophers don't, and that is the characteristic of philosophy at present, that there's a bit of a shortage of agreement about what it has established. But that being said, I think philosophers have certainly purported to have produced very general principles of ethics, for example. Obvious example, not a principle I agree with, but an example of one up for discussion would be utilitarianism, the principle that an action is always good insofar as its effects are good, insofar as it produces greater happiness rather than misery. And that's a principle. Certainly not one science can have any say for or against. It's not relevant to science. But if it were a true principle, then it would have been a discovery. I don't think it is a true principle, but at any rate, there's been an attempt to produce true principles, which is a start. I think philosophers have shown that various arguments of the past are false, and various worldviews won't do as they stand and need to be improved in various ways. So philosophy has deepened our understanding of the world in the sense that it provides the tools for understanding what science has, the discoveries of science really amount to. Does science discover the ultimate principles, or are there further principles beyond that science can't discover, for example, God? Or has science discovered, as scientists frequently say they've discovered, that time is an illusion, or that there's no absolute simultaneity, or that we don't have free will? And philosophers can come along and say, well, uh, you haven't you've only discovered that if you mean so-and-so by time, but not if you mean such and such by time. You've only discovered this about free will if you mean that by free will and not the other free will. So it helps to, as it were, cut down to size certain very general pronouncements of the world about what it's like. It helps to suggest good arguments and ways of settling the big issues which have always been with us before philosophy, such as whether there's a God, whether there are souls, or whether we have free will, whether there are moral truths, and so on. These philosophy has helped to see how we can solve them and to clarify what they're about, and that's progress. Well, I think it's in a lot better state than when I started, yes, no question about that. I was an undergraduate and a graduate student in Oxford in the 1950s, and this was the era of what is called ordinary language philosophy. That is, philosophers have got tired of the big metaphysical systems of the past, saying we do or we don't have free will, or that there are really souls and bodies or forms independent of matter and so on. And it says all of these things are unverifiable and so on. And we ought to solve the problems of the past by just looking rather carefully about how words are used. And for example, we could solve the problem of free will if we just paid attention to the sort of things that we say are free. Somebody isn't free to do some act if they're locked in prison. Someone is free to do an act if nobody is twisting their arm and they're capable of doing it. And if we sort out these various ways in which we use words, there won't be any philosophical problems left. It's a bit of a caricature of what was going on in the 50s, but not much, and it was very much, Oxford in the 1950s was very much dominated by J.L. Austin, whose philosophy this was. Well, it's undergone what is known as a metaphysical turn since then, in the late 60s and 70s, and people are back to investigating the old problems that Plato investigated, whether there are souls as well as bodies, whether everything is material, whether there are ethical truths, and so on. And I think that's progress. The mind-body problem is the name of the problem. I do talk about that, but I don't use the word mind in my book for the simple reason that it's used in very many different senses. Everybody who does philosophy admits that humans have minds. The question is what minds are. Is talk about mind just talk about people, say someone has a good mind, is simply to talk about them behaving intelligently, or it may be to say that they have some immaterial part. It's used in so many vague ways that it's not a very useful word for me to describe my own views. And therefore, I prefer the word soul. That, again, can be ambiguous, but there is one clear sense, which I think everybody understands, of a soul as a separate part of the body, an immaterial part, which is connected with the body. And of course, in that sense, most philosophers don't believe that there are souls. I do, and the book is an argument for that. So that's why I bring the book in, the word soul in. It's what I'm campaigning for rather than the problem I'm trying to solve. Well, I don't see why they shouldn't in my sense, and sometimes they do. That is to say, I'm using soul, as I said, in the sense of an immaterial part of us in interaction with our bodies. And someone could admit that there are such things without being in any way religious. But if people feel that it's got too much of a religious tone to it. As I say in the book, well, just use a different word for what I'm talking about, and the obvious different word is self. You can say, is there a separate self from our bodies? Science can produce many results, but the question is interpreting those results, what they amount to. Scientists like nice, precise questions to which they can devise an experiment, which if it gives one result will show one theory to be right, and if it gives a different result will give a different theory to be right. But there is the issue of just what the information we've long held amounts to. And the information we've long held are, to my mind, that we have thoughts and feelings as well as events happening in our brains, and we have, each of us continues to exist over time, and therefore the issue is, well, what constitutes me existing over time as opposed to somebody like me waking up tomorrow? What constitutes me waking up tomorrow? Are brain events separate things from thoughts and feelings, or are thoughts and feelings really brain events? And we've got all the data for that. The question is how you interpret them. What's the right way of sorting them out? And that's what philosophers have been concerned with. I say all the data, that's not altogether true. There are certain recent developments of science which are crucially relevant, and the moment such a development turns up, as it does in various areas of philosophy, well, of course, we must take account of it, and it's been very much the hallmark of philosophy as done in the Anglo-American world in recent years, that it's been very sensitive to the latest developments of science. On this point, there's been a lot of neuroscience, which is relevant, not quite as relevant as neuroscientists think sometimes, but is relevant. For example, something I think is very relevant is not merely the discovery that our consciousness depends on our cerebral hemispheres, that is the top part of our brain, and there are two of these, a left and a right one, but the very interesting discovery that if you take out one of these hemispheres, and sometimes people who have severe epilepsy do have a whole hemisphere removed, that doesn't make any great significant difference to what they remember, how they behave, and so on. It makes a bit of difference to their motor powers, but not to the way they think and so on. And it doesn't matter whether you take the left one out or the right one out. And that's a very interesting discovery, because if you connect this with another, not so much discovery, but technique that is being developed of repairing severed nerves, it raises the possibility of removing a hemisphere from one brain and transplanting it into another brain. And then, since each hemisphere, as it were, has the correlates of the same memories and character, which one would be me if this had happened to me? Philosophers have, before all this was discovered, philosophers have sort of thought about the possibility of brain transplants and so on, and some people have said, oh, well, that's just a thought experiment, you don't want to take that too seriously. I think you do need to take thought experiments seriously, but at any rate, this is now passing it into real life stuff, and that is something that philosophers ought to take serious account of. There are some things about us. Yes, there are certainly things that are beyond scientific understanding. The most obvious thing about us that is beyond scientific understanding is why each of us exists at all. What I mean by that is, sure, there may be a scientific explanation, even if you think my way in terms of souls, of why a fetus at a certain stage of its development gives rise to a soul. and perhaps there's some law of nature saying all fetuses in state X cause the existence of souls. A rather odd scientific law, but still perhaps there is one. Okay, but it won't show why it's my soul that is connected to this body and your soul that's connected to that body, or the other way around, because science explains in terms of laws of nature. And laws of nature have the form all objects of such and such a kind cause other objects of such and such a kind, or cause such and such effects. But they're general statements. All things like this produce things like this. Okay, all fetuses produce souls. But souls differ from each other. You could have two souls which have exactly the same thoughts and feelings, but they would be different souls. They are numerically different. They have what I would call this, or an old word, thisness. That is to say, they're not different from each other because one has one property and the other has another property. They're just different. And given that, then science couldn't possibly explain why it was my soul that was connected to this body, or indeed that my soul came into existence at all, but instead there came into existence in connection with me a soul which had the same thoughts and feelings and went on living in this body. So certainly that's one thing that science couldn't possibly discover. And on a more general issues, it couldn't discover, couldn't show why there's a physical universe at all, why it's governed by regular laws of nature, why the laws are the laws they are, because science explains one law by another and can't explain the most general laws, and so on.